If you hate injustice, if you're fighting for the poor, you're going to have opponents. The challenge is, how do you recognize and validate and love their full humanity, love the image of God that they bear, right? That's something I'm still struggling to do, but I do know that that's the way forward if we're going to save this American experiment.
What's up, friends? Take a look. I am not in the studio. Today, I am in Austin, Texas, because I'm having an in-person conversation with Representative James Tallarico in front of a live studio audience. I cannot wait to share this conversation with you. It was amazing. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Talk to y'all later on. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. Hi. Welcome. This is so cool. I need a picture of this from my angle so I can show my wife. See, I'm doing things. I swear. This work is worth it. All right. Awesome. Hey, good to see everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's so cool to be in Austin, Texas. We had barbecue last night, and I can definitely say that things are bigger in Texas than in New Jersey. So I've been eating cleaner more and more, and this is the first time in a while I had barbecue, and it was intense. But
Where did you go?
Terry Black's Barbecue.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, all right. It was recommended by a local.
Yep.
All right, to be clear, I didn't Google it. So anyway, it's great to see you.
It's good to see you.
Absolutely. So friends, couple need to knows here, and then we'll kind of get rolling. First off, again, welcome. I want to give a few thank yous. I wrote them down. I want to thank all the volunteers who have been here helping make all this happen. So thank you so much. I want to thank Rebecca, who is one of our volunteers, who is the event organizer behind all of this. She got the coffee. She made sure we had the space. So thank you, Rebecca. I want to thank Matt and Nick. They're our camera crew who flew out with me from New Jersey. Of course, I want to thank the seminary for hosting us. Really cool. They've been so great to work with, giving us, this room is so beautiful. So, and it looks awesome. And I want to thank, of course, our sponsors, Americans United and Faithful America, two great groups that we do a lot of work with, helping to defend democracy and fight for a more inclusive society. And of course, I want to thank every one of you for coming out and spending time with us and Representative James Tallarico. It's a pleasure. So thank you so much.
Glad to be here.
It means a lot.
Oh.
Thank you. Matt, are we recording these? Are we good? Awesome. Great. All right. So here's the plan tonight. Couple things. We have this TV screen, and there's some QR codes here. One of them is for a Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you can scan that QR code. We will get it. We're going to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll take a little break. We can refuel our coffee cups, use the bathroom. Then we'll do a Q&A. And after this event, you're welcome to join us. We're going to be going to Lazarus's Brewing Company, the one on Airport Boulevard, after this event. You're more than welcome to hang out with us, and we can eat tacos. That's apparently a thing in Texas.
That's right. Yeah.
Taco Bell is my taco, so it's I know. Listen, we have in New Jersey, we have great pizza. Okay,
Sure.
we will destroy anyone on pizza,
Sure,
but tacos,
sure.
I concede, it's not our strong suit.
That's
all
right.
right, so
That's right.
no state is perfect.
That's right.
But New Jersey is close.
That's
So-
right.
So that's kind of the plan for this evening. And again, you can scan the QR code over there and we'll do that. So I do want to get into our conversation. Yeah. I love being able to talk to people, and talking to a politician is new for me. Full transparency. I had you on the podcast one time, and that, I got to be honest, James, that was, it was intentional. I said to myself, if James and I get along, I might float this idea by him of, what if I flew out to you and we filmed in studio, like live, and it worked.
That's
so
right. We got along.
I'm honored. Yeah, so it worked out great. One of my questions for you is, and we kind of got into your backstory on the previous podcast, so people can catch up there, but what got you into politics initially? I mean, why did you decide to run for representative and get into the world of politics?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me, and thank y'all for being here. This is my school. This is where I spend my time with my classmates and my professors, learning and exploring the gospel. And if I say anything wrong, I know I have some of my professors here in the room. So please hold your comments till tomorrow. But
you're not being graded, don't
that's
worry.
Right, that's right. Yeah, and so my granddad was a Baptist preacher. I know we're here at a Presbyterian seminary, but he was a Baptist preacher in South Texas, in Laredo, right on the border with Mexico. And he taught me at a very early age that Jesus gave us two commandments: love God and love neighbor. And so to me, Christianity has always been spiritual and political.
Yeah.
Because politics at its most fundamental level is just another word for how we treat our neighbors. And so I became a public school teacher on the west side of San Antonio to serve my neighbors. I led an education nonprofit to serve my neighbors. And then when a seat opened up in the Texas legislature in my hometown, I ran for it out of service to my neighbors. And so that has kind of been the through line in my career so far. And obviously, loving thy neighbor in the Texas legislature is not easy. And so when things get difficult, I fall back on my faith. And in my second term, I enrolled here at Austin Seminary to follow Jesus's first commandment, to love God. And as a seminarian and a lawmaker, I'm just starting to understand how these two commands sustain, challenge, and enrich each other in inner life and in outer life. And so I was sitting at this intersection of religion and politics when Christian nationalism reared its ugly head at the state capitol.
Yeah.
A bill to force every teacher to display the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
A bill to replace school counselors with untrained, unsupervised religious chaplains. A bill to defund public schools to subsidize private Christian schools. And most recently, a bill to teach Christian Bible stories as historical fact to our elementary school students.
Yeah.
And so religion and politics are on a collision course in this state and in this country. And I think all of us are now asking the same urgent question: what is the relationship between religion and politics, between church and state? And I think the future of Christianity and the future of democracy are going to depend on our answers.
It's interesting because I grew up in New Jersey, which is known to be a more liberal state.
Sure.
You're in Texas, and we had polar opposite experiences.
Yeah.
Right. I was homeschooled. I was singing songs that, yes, I'm in the Lord's army. Sure. I was attending the March for Life rally. I mean, I tell this story often. At age 15, I had a mohawk because I was a drummer, and I loved Travis Barker, so I wanted to look just like him, but I was also Christian.
Sure.
So I had to prove it by wearing a big shirt. It was so loud, in all caps: abortion is homicide. Wow. And on the back, it had three statements. It said, "You will not silence my message. You will not mock my God. You will stop killing my generation." Wow. All right. So that's the world. That's the Christianity I was a part of at age 15, thinking that I'm being countercultural by advocating for these values.
Sure.
So I'm kind of curious because I don't often get people who can see this in real time. Show of hands, who grew up similar to how I did in evangelicalism? Okay. A good chunk of you. Thank you. I feel so less alone now. Imagine there were just no hands. It's like, I guess it was just me. So, but that was the faith tradition I was raised in.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that it was possible to be different. In fact, people warned me that people like you were probably not true Christians. Yeah. Did you hear about people like us when you were growing up, about like us folks?
I didn't hear about y'all. I grew up with y'all.
Oh,
okay. I grew up in Williamson County, Texas, in Round Rock. And, back in the 1990s, it was a pretty conservative place. So all of my classmates were evangelical Republicans. All my teachers were evangelical Republicans.
Yeah.
This was during the Bush years. So that was the environment that I grew up in. I think the only reason that I didn't quite align with that group is because of my pastor growing up, who was actually a graduate of Austin Seminary, of this institution.
Wow.
Dr. Jim Rigby. And he's still the head pastor at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, just right outside Austin city limits, a few miles up I-35. And, he taught us that our love for God and for neighbor required a commitment to justice. And that commitment, led him to organize protests on all kinds of issues. And it led him to organize us as members of the congregation to be involved in the community in a political way.
Yeah.
Never in a partisan way. And I think we're going to get into the difference between being partisan and being political.
Right.
But I credit that with Dr. Jim. He gifted me this healthy, vibrant theology. I oftentimes, when I'm in class with my fellow seminary students, they're all like unloading their religious baggage that they were given. And I'm like that kid with healthy, loving parents, in the conversation. It's a true gift that he gave to me and my family and my fellow congregation members at that church.
Yeah, I mean, I get those DMs every day, and I understand it because I grew up in it. And it's oftentimes it's complicated because I do think about my own tradition and how in a lot of ways it gave me a place to call home. I mean, I worked with, as a teenager, Child Evangelism Fellowship. They're one of the largest like missions organizations for kids, and they're very evangelical. And I'm working with these people who thought that Sandy Patty was too rock and roll, right? And I had this Under Oath t-shirt on, I'm wearing black jeans and my hat sideways, and they took me in and were like, no, like you don't have to change, right? So I have those moments, but also in the broader scheme of things, thinking about the theology I was given, I'm totally depraved and that I'm just hellbound if I don't always repent. And I have an obligation to save people from the depths of hell with this gospel, and just where it ended up. I'm not sure if it drifted this way or if I just realized it was drifting that way, but where things ended up, it was just jarring because it's like, wait, I thought because we had the same beliefs, we shared the same values, and we don't. Like we have the same beliefs, but our values are just night and day. And so it's a lot of people who talk to me, and I'm one of them, because I shared the experience. It's like, it wasn't all good or all bad. It was just really messy. And I have a lot of people that I appreciate who I met in that world, but I had to find a better path forward because where it was leading me, especially now watching Christians that I know who go to church every Sunday, repeat the talking point that Haitian immigrants are eating pets. I'm like, now I'm not like a biblical literalist these days, but the whole loving your neighbor thing is like pretty clear still, and it's just, it's, I don't always have words for it, frankly.
Well, and to see,
and bring that mic a little bit closer to you, by the way.
Seeing some of our evangelical friends taking to the internet to say, that commandment to love our neighbors really just meant our neighbors next to us, and the Haitians, they're not our neighbors. They live in Haiti. And sometimes I listen to these Christian nationalists and I think, did we read the same book? But I do think it's important to recognize that religion is an inheritance. It's something that we've received, that's been passed on, and that's complicated. But there can be beautiful things even in your inheritance. I think about my conservative evangelical friends and teachers that I grew up with. The idea that the gospel should move us to act in the world, that's a beautiful, true thing. The idea that it is countercultural, that is true. I don't know if it was applied correctly to that that issue, but that is true, and that we should take the teachings of Jesus out into the world, and that the world needs saving. I think those are beautiful things that we get from our evangelical friends, even if I think the tree is bearing some pretty rotten fruit at this point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people here listen to our stuff and hear your stuff, so I think a lot of us are aware of what's going on. The question is like, what do we do, right? And this is the $1 million question. I asked this question. I was telling you before we hopped on stage that I was at Georgetown University this past week with George Wallace and Kristen Dumais. I'm at this summit with them, just standing there like, what am I doing here? But I'm asking them like, you guys are the experts. Like, what do we do? You're a Christian. I mean, Jim Wallace has been, I think he's 5 decades into doing this work, right? I mean, just it's crazy. And I think it's important that we think about, especially coming up upon an election cycle, I've been wrestling with some things that I would love your perspectives on. And one of them is, it is interesting because sometimes when people deconstruct their faith, so to speak, they end up like leaving the house of Christian faith altogether. I get that, it's fine. But that was never my journey. I deconstructed because I went deeper into my faith, right? I couldn't reconcile this Jesus thing and this like evangelical thing anymore. And so as I've been doing this work, I've only become more radical in so many ways, right? Like I really find empire problematic. I find what's happening around the world problematic, et cetera. And so what I'm struggling with is, I know what I don't want to be. I do not want to plant a flag of a politician in my front yard and be like, this person's saving America, right? Like God will restore us if we just vote this person in. At the same time, I'm terrified of being what MLK calls is the white moderate, right? Who just really, it's really when bystander becomes a verb, right? Like it actually enables what we see. And also, I don't want to become a sycophant again. But I got to land somewhere, and I have to vote, and I also have to have allegiance to a crucified Messiah who was underneath the Buddha empire. And you're a politician. You're in the belly of it. You're in the swamp, so to speak. You know. And I'm wondering for you, how do you think about your allegiance to Jesus being primary, but also realizing that in an imperfect world, you're in a system that is flawed. Even your own political party might be doing things that you're like, guys, like this just ain't it.
That's right.
How do you draw some of those? How do you pull those tensions, and how do you draw some of those boundaries for you?
Yeah, so there's so many directions we could go in. One,
that's why I flew out here.
Yeah,
so I
want to thank you for naming that being neutral or being non-political is taking the side of the powerful. It's protecting the status quo, and a lot of white Christians fall into that trap of saying, well, I'm just going to abstain from this discussion. I'm not going to pick sides. And when you do that, you're picking a side, right? And, you know, Christianity at its best challenged the empire, challenged the feudal system, challenged slavery, challenged Jim Crow. I mean, I believe that's what we are called to as Christians, the demolition of domination. And we have to continue that work today. And it goes beyond just offering charity to our neighbors. It requires that we challenge the systems that make charity necessary. I mean, the Roman Empire didn't crucify Jesus for being a nice guy, right? Crucifixion was the punishment for rebels. Jesus provoked a direct conflict with the ruling class, with the rich and the powerful, the political, economic, and religious powers that be. And so anytime a government or a corporation or a church is tyrannical and oppressive, I believe it's in conflict with Jesus. And so, you know, I think you and I have talked about the when we were kids in the 90s, a lot of people had the bracelets with WWJD, right?
How can I forget?
What would Jesus do? I think it's actually a helpful question today. What would Jesus do about a tax system that benefits the rich over the poor? What would Jesus do about a healthcare system that forces the sick to start GoFundMe pages to afford life-saving surgeries? What would Jesus do about an education system that ties a child's school funding to their community's property wealth? What would Jesus do about a justice system that incarcerates more human beings than any other country on the face of the earth? And what would he do about an economic system that values profits over the health of our planet? Right? Would he just stay in his room and pray? Or would he walk into the seat of power and flip over the tables of injustice? So it's important that we as Christians are questioning and challenging and dismantling these unjust systems that are hurting our neighbors. And the way we do that in a democracy is through politics. Not partisanship, because I think you're right. You know, our allegiance as Christians is to Jesus. It's not to the United States. It's not to a political party. It's not to an ideology. Jesus is far more radical than any political candidate or political party or political ideology. And I should say, because I am a politician, my campaign manager, whenever I say the word radical, he's like, don't say that. You know, it's going to freak people out. Let me just clarify. When I use the word radical, I don't mean extreme. That word radical, as many of you know, comes from the Latin word for root. Right? Jesus goes to the root of our problems and invites us to deeper love, deeper justice, deeper peace. So I think Jesus should challenge our politics, whether we're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're a socialist or a capitalist, a libertarian or a communist. Jesus should challenge our certainties. And if our Christianity is not unsettling us, then we're doing it wrong.
No, I agree. And by the way, you shouldn't throw out the root words of things. There are professors here. They can fact check
That's
in the
true.
moment. Be like, actually,
fact check tomorrow, not today.
That's not entirely correct.
That's right.
Thank you. No, I mean, I agree with you. And what I struggle with so often is what you just said, that whole, statement about schools and healthcare systems. I don't think those are crazy ideas, right? Like we live in the world's richest country, which of course we can talk about how we got that wealth, but we're here. And medical debt is like the second highest form of debt.
That's right.
People go bankrupt over it.
Yep.
And it's like, guys, it's not Marxist. It might be, I don't care if it is, but it's not, like, entirely anyway. To be like, maybe we should figure out a way where people don't go bankrupt for getting healthcare. Like, this is not wild to me. But for some reason in the world that we live in, the social media world, when you advocate for any of that stuff, or you can even be use real moderate language, let's be empathetic to our immigrant neighbors. Even that, it's like, why is this so radical? Because it doesn't feel that way to me. When, as you're in the, doing all your politician stuff, in these legislatures, I don't know how it works. I'm a homeschooler, Becca was my curriculum. So, but I'm just curious, like how do you keep your composure? Because you do come across very composed. I'm wondering if you have like a rage room at home where you just get all the anger out, but you're in these spaces. I'm sure you're hearing things that internally you're like, that's batshit crazy. Yeah. But you have to be like, well, okay, politician, here's how we navigate this. How do you balance that stuff?
It's so funny you bring up Marxism. I think my ethics professor, Professor Greenway, is here. Or he was here. Oh, he's in the back. He was talking the other day about what Marx lacked was an understanding of the fall. The idea that imperfect human beings could, by force, be able to bring about utopia. That was the downfall of that experiment. And so that should bring us back to this value of democracy, that we are, as Christians, attempting to encourage nonviolent self-governance.
Yes.
Of thy neighbor, by thy neighbor, for thy neighbor. And so, I know that's the theme of this event is what is our relationship with democracy? And I think if this American experiment in self-governance is going to survive and hopefully flourish into the future, because it's an ongoing experiment.
It's pretty new,
right?
Granted, yeah.
And it's an unfulfilled promise still. This many years later. But if that's going to continue, if we're going to continue the experiment, if we're going to continue the project and try to move toward a more perfect union, it's going to require a Christian commitment to democracy. Yeah. And it's something we don't have right now. Yeah. And so I'm hopeful that's what the people in this room and the people watching can be a part of. Our Christian nationalist friends often say this country was built on Judeo-Christian values. Yeah. Of course, I think adding Judeo as a qualifier to Christianity is insulting to our Jewish 100% friends, but
also kind of an oxymoron. They're very different,
Well, but I think there is some truth in there because, when I read our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, about all people being created equal, all people being endowed with certain unalienable rights, I hear the radical teachings of Jesus, the ideas, the values of justice and fairness, the idea of resolving our conflicts peacefully, of serving one another, of listening to one another. Those are Christian values. I believe democracy is a Christian value. And I think that's something we should articulate more, especially now when so many Christians, Christian nationalists at least, have given up on democracy.
I often hear people say, we're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. Okay. And I just don't know enough to be like, no or yes.
Yeah,
can you break this down?
It's a good question.
What do I say to that? Like, what's the actual data here? What actually are we as a country?
Well, it's a kind of a tricky sleight of hand when people say stuff like that. And I've had folks say it to me too. Democracy is, I like to think of it as kind of an umbrella term for all kinds of self-governance, government of the people. That can take a lot of different forms, right? And you have Western European countries that have parliamentary systems. You have a constitutional republic like ours, but those are all democratic fundamentally, small d democratic. So yeah, some folks maybe want to get around the term democracy, which should be a red flag when people are trying to distance themselves from democracy. It seems pretty un-American, and un-Christian. To me.
Okay, that's helpful because you're right. I hear that and I'm like, that sounds sus, but I don't have the language to be like, I know what you're doing. So thank you for that. That's helpful.
They're specifying what form of democracy we have, right? We don't have a direct democracy. We don't all show up at the town square and vote on everything as citizens. We're a pretty big country, and that would be difficult to implement. But direct democracy is a form of democracy, participatory democracy, representative democracy. They're all under that umbrella. And that umbrella is the idea that people should be able to govern themselves and that we should be able to resolve our conflicts nonviolently. And to me, that's a very Christian idea.
Yeah. Have you seen a rise of anti-democratic language kind of gaining ground in some of, I want to be clear, not necessarily Republican or even conservative spaces, because there is a difference there. Right? Yeah. There are people like David French or Russell Moore and Adam Kinzinger, right? He would be much more conservative than myself on many issues, but they're committed to democratic norms, right? So when I'm talking about this for sake of the conversation, we're talking about really Christian nationalism and what's happening in those more far right spaces. Have you seen either in your local, in local legislatures or even nationally, more rhetoric that sounds like, I think we're trying to chip away at like what is these very important democratic norms that actually are in place to protect all of our neighbors and to do our best to make that American dream realized, even though it's still not fully realized.
Yeah, and that last part's really important because some of us can get in the habit of talking about defending democracy or preserving democracy.
Right.
American democracy doesn't work for a lot of people right now. And it is deeply broken. I see the corruption firsthand every day in the halls of the Capitol. I see how things like gerrymandering and voter suppression distort our democratic system. So I'm not interested in defending that system. Right. I'm interested in fixing it and building upon it to reach that more perfect union. So democracy, as I said, is a project, and it's a movement. It's something we are in the process of becoming. And we should never get in the habit of defending it. Because I think for a lot of people who have been left out by this system, they hear this language of preservation and it repels them, rightfully so. Right. And then we are pushing them into the arms of the autocrats and the demagogues who are preying on their fears and their anxieties and their pain in this changing world. And that's what Christian nationalists are doing. They are trying to convince us that our neighbors are to blame for our alienation, that domination can calm our anxieties, that democracy is not the solution but the problem.
Right.
It's been said before that when fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross.
Yeah.
Christian nationalists are using our faith tradition, our beautiful religion, to advance their own social, economic, and political power.
Yeah.
And so, we oftentimes get asked to define Christian nationalism. So let me offer my definition. There are lots of different definitions. I think of it as the worship of power. All kinds of power, social power, economic power, political power in the name of Christ.
Right.
And the reason I define it so broadly is because I think that we have been struggling with Christian nationalism for centuries in the church. 300 years after Jesus was executed by the Roman Empire, Emperor Constantine and those immediately after him made Christianity the official state religion of that very same empire. And so I often say that Constantine was the first Christian nationalist. It's important to understand that we've been struggling with this phenomenon for the entire history of the church. The powers that be have always tried to tame and domesticate this wild religion of love because it's such a threat to their entrenched power and wealth.
Dr. Adam Clark, he was mentored by James Cone directly, friend of the show, and amazing, just fantastic. And he said something a while ago that I said, yes, that's it. He goes, it's not Christianity, it's Christianities. And which stream are we participating in? Because you're right. And we can look back all through history and see a stream of Christian thinking that caused a lot of damage and was power hungry, right? And it goes way back. And it manifests itself through the doctrine of discovery and just through colonization, et cetera. But then all along too, there's also like this resistance, right? Of like, no, we have to divest our power because the person that we're claiming to follow bore a cross for his enemies instead of trying to build a cross for his enemies, right? And I think that's really important because again, in my faith tradition growing up, I was kind of given this black or white, we are the true Christians,
Sure.
and there is nothing else. Right? And
Sure.
the analogy we use all the time is like this house metaphor. And a lot of us grew up in this basement. It was just this dark, moldy basement. And it was like, this is it. Like, here you go. And if you leave, it's a wasteland above ground. And so eventually, for whatever reason, we got above ground and we go, oh my gosh, there's actually a huge house of Christian thought that's complicated, contradictory, and has maybe better paths available to us that don't make us feel like we're choosing between our queer neighbors or Jesus. You know, maybe the only option isn't leaving all faith completely or becoming a MAGA nationalist Christian, right? And so I think it's important that we realize in the American context that we sit in, especially in white evangelicalism in particular, right? There's a long legacy that actually makes Trump the fruit of some pretty deep roots that people like myself just never knew about, right? I mean, literally, I swear to you, I was taught MLK fixed racism in the 60s. The end. And now everything's great. Like literally, I wasn't told about, the white evangelicals like Bob Jones, who literally tried to sue the government over the right to maintain those kinds of policies, or why the moral majority got started, or how racism is indeed not solved with MLK. Like, there's more work to do. I just grew up in a totally different world. And when you break out of that, it is simultaneously overwhelming. It's like shell shocking. And you're also mourning the loss of what you thought was all beautiful and all good, right? And it turns out, and I like to just be blunt. I'm from New Jersey, I do swear sometimes. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But I'm like, what the hell? Why was I never told this shit? Like, why was I never told about the history of my own tradition? And so I think that the reason why it's so important now to have these conversations and have folks like yourself help us is because so many people, and I'm sure you hear from them too, are so hungry for a justice-oriented, inclusive path that humanizes all of our neighbors because we find it congruent with Jesus, not opposed to him, right? And so I think that's just a really important thing that we think about as we go into this election cycle and even beyond. There's so much work to do, that we are always trying to humanize the other.
That's right.
Even our enemies. And for me, sometimes I'll get trolls. They'll be like, tell me, what's actually hard about being a Christian for you? Because you're inclusive, and I'm like, loving my enemies. I don't want to do that. Trust me, I don't want to love you. I have a lot of words for you. I have a lot of words for Trump. I have a ton of them. I have a lot of words for Charlie Kirk, who I've met him several times now. We've shook hands, and I'm like, I just want to but my faith compels me to humanize you, because the second I hop on that path that you're on, it leads down a path of violence. And my faith compels me to humanize and see the full imago Dei inside. I think that's really important as we navigate.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, Dorothy Day has this great quote about, I only really love God as much as I love the person I love the least. And I think it's a challenge to progressive Christians like me to kind of try to take the log out of our own eye and think, do we love Donald Trump? That's probably an uncomfortable question for a lot of us.
We'll edit that part out.
Yeah. I just lost my next Democratic primary.
We're all wrapped up. We're all good, right?
I personally, being that I am a politician and a seminarian and I'm navigating these two roles, I think loving your enemy is the one teaching that can save democracy, both here and around the world. I think that's where the answer is. And it's something I struggle with all the time, because I feel myself in the Texas Capitol getting so angry with my colleagues. Right. I mean, these are the men that I work with, banned abortion, even in cases of rape and incest and threats to the mother's health. Since that day, 26,000 Texas women have been forced to give birth after a rape. Infant and maternal mortality have spiked. Pregnant women are being told to wait in emergency room parking lots until they go into sepsis in the state of Texas because of the decision that was made by my colleagues a few blocks from here. And, I've been on the floor when they've passed bills to hurt trans children, some of the most vulnerable kids in our community. It's hard enough to be different as a kid. And these politicians are using their immense power to hunt those children
Yeah.
right in front of our eyes. And so I feel anger.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to balance that anger with recognizing their full humanity. And that can be helpful because even after those days on the House floor when they pass these morally repugnant, these incredibly dangerous pieces of legislation, the next day we've got to get back on that floor and they may be my allies. In fact, they were my allies in this fight for public education. The only reason that we stopped this effort to defund public schools and subsidize private religious schools is because rural, small-town Republicans from the Panhandle, from East Texas, they stuck with me on that fight. It was a bipartisan coalition that saved the institution of public education in this state. So that's really hard work to do.
Yeah.
You know, I was elected as the youngest member of the legislature back in 2018, so I'm often asked to come speak to young people. And they're always like, you know, what do you need to do to run for office and be a politician? And I always tell them you have to kind of be a sociopath because
We're not editing that part out.
Yeah, you
That's
keep
what I
it.
say.
It's true. You have to in some ways compartmentalize a little bit. And I found the only way not to compartmentalize, because I don't think that's healthy, is to love your enemy and go deeper into that teaching. Because it's telling. Jesus told us we're going to have enemies, right? If you hate injustice, if you're fighting for the poor, you're going to have opponents.
Yeah.
The challenge is, how do you recognize and validate and love their full humanity, love the image of God that they bear, right? That's something I'm still struggling to do, but I do know that that's the way forward if we're going to save this American experiment.
Okay, I'm gonna give you a hard question now.
Okay.
And I'm gonna throw out myself too.
Okay.
Because I can hear people.
Yeah.
Two white dudes,
Sure.
you know, super privileged,
Yeah.
don't have to actually deal with the fear of these draconian abortion laws or, you know, anti-queer legislation being passed.
Yep.
It's easy for us to say, and it's true. I mean, this is not I'm not like poking fun. It's true.
That's right.
Easy to say, well, love your enemies, because like, what are they doing for you? I mean, and frankly, the church I grew up in, like the world I grew up in, was built for people like me.
That's right.
You know, I'm what I call bro-evangelical passing still, you know, so I can speak that language. I still look like one of them.
Yeah.
And that world was built for patriarchy. Like I was just primed.
Yeah.
So I'm curious for you, how you find the balance between, no matter who you are, there's a teaching of Jesus to love your enemy. If you're a Christ follower, it's there. We got to deal with it, no matter who you are. How do you deal with that, but also doing everything you can to resist the legislation, the power that these folks want, that we know would do so much damage to our neighbors? How do you balance that? Because I get asked that question all the time.
Yeah.
You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, such a good question. I'm so glad you brought it up. You know, we use the word privilege a lot. I think maybe a better word, at least in this conversation, is responsibility. Because I think you and I have a greater responsibility to love our enemies.
Yeah.
So that those trans kids that show up at the Texas Capitol to just advocate for their basic humanity, so they don't have to.
Yeah.
You know, I can oftentimes connect with some of my Republican colleagues because we share a lot, right? For the most part, the Republican caucus here in Texas is white, older men, straight, cisgendered men from small towns. That tends to be, you know, and then the Democratic caucus is everybody who's not that. So it's kind of a mess of a coalition, because it's everyone who doesn't fall into that bucket. And it's like, we don't have much in common, except for the, you know, but so I think it is important for the members of that pro-democracy coalition. And I shouldn't just say the Democratic Party, because there are a lot of people who aren't a part of that institution who are joining the pro-democracy coalition. Dick Cheney just came out for democracy.
That kind of scares me, though. Can I just say I'm a little worried about, I'm like, you know, Jake, I appreciate you saying you're endorsing Harris, but like, we haven't forgotten, you know, like what happened a long time ago. You're kind of a warmonger. You know, I don't know.
Yes.
I can say that. You don't have to say anything. I'll say it for you, you know?
My first protest that I ever went to was with my church, and it was against the Iraq War in 2003. I was in middle school. It was on the South Congress Bridge. It was one of kind of defining political experiences of my life. But so I haven't forgotten either. But I do know that politics is a game of addition, not subtraction. And that if we're going to save this experiment in a few weeks, we've got to build a huge tent. And at this point, I don't even know if it's a tent. It's like an airplane hangar where everyone's just like huddled together.
Get in.
Yeah, Dick Cheney and AOC, we're all here.
Whoa.
So
what a world.
It's in some ways, it's a beautiful thing. It really is. But back to your question, those of us who have a lot of privilege in that coalition, we have a lot of responsibility.
Totally.
And so, in some ways, I feel like it is my job to be the one out front, engaging with my Republican colleagues behind the scenes or on the House floor, so that my colleagues whose lives are more at risk, or the citizens whose lives are more at risk, don't have to as much. That's how I would, for those that are watching that also have the same level of privilege that you and I do, that's how I would ask them to think about it in a constructive, productive way. No need to sit and cry over, your whiteness or your masculinity.
Right.
Use it.
Yep.
Use it to do something.
Yeah.
Let's be productive.
Yeah, when I first started New Evangelicals online, I discovered the world of deconstruction, and I realized very quick that people like me were the problem. And I'm like, oh no, like, I'm this white dude. I started this account, it's blowing up. I'm like, what do I do? And I had just a good friend of mine and black woman, just a very close friend, still to this day, we're very close. And I was telling her, I'm like, so-and-so, like, what do I do? Like, I feel all this awareness and guilt. I just had no idea. And she's like, just use your privilege for good, white boy. And I'm like, I can do that. Okay, yeah, I can definitely do that.
No one needs you to wallow.
Right, I'm like, okay, I can do that. And I tell people often, first off, personally, I kind of see this work as my act of repentance. Like, I didn't know what I was part of, but I was still complicit in it. And I still believe in repentance, right? To turn and go the other way. So I have an obligation to do that. But also, I really push, especially if you're a white man who grew up like me, you have the biggest responsibility to do everything you can to raise the alarm bell and to also advocate for a better path. That's why I go to Turning Point USA events, right? Because I know my other neighbors shouldn't be going there. Like, it's not on my BIPOC neighbor or queer neighbor to go there to talk to those people. That's on me. And they have other jobs that are very important, right? But I agree. We have to think about what is the responsibility that we have, not to, I used to say when I didn't know better, I want to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. We're like, no, everyone has a voice, Tim. Just amplify it. I'm like, oh, you're right. We'll just give them the platform instead, right? And I think that's the move going forward, is how do we use what we can't control, right? To amplify the voices of others, to do the work that maybe only we can do, to help maybe dismantle some of this stuff from the inside out in hopes of pushing for a better path forward in our faith.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as we're especially using our religious privilege, because obviously we've all got different kinds of privilege, different kinds of responsibilities, and all of us that are Christian here in this room, we're in a Christian space at this seminary. We've got such a special responsibility in this moment, and we've got to speak out against this perversion of our faith. Yeah. You were mentioning earlier Christianities. And I think, and I agree with that in some ways, and then disagree in other ways, because there's
you can't challenge the host.
Sure, that's true. That's true.
I flew out here.
That's
you have to say yes to everything I say.
That's right. John Sharp was an old school Texas politician, in like the best sense, right? Like he memorized your name. He knew about your family. He was a great elected official. He's now the chancellor of Texas A&M University, and he once told me a great line that I've always thought about. He said, "You've got to keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out." And to me, that's always been so helpful, because part of me wants to, I'm never in the business of saying someone's not a Christian, because that, of course, has been lobbed at me. I'm sure it's been lobbed at people in this room. We are all part of the body of Christ in this tradition.
Right.
And these are our siblings in Christ. But, and this is the Protestant in me, we do have a tradition that we've inherited. And there are some claims that are made in that tradition by Jesus himself. I already mentioned Professor Greenway once, but he talked about how moral relativism is used as a weapon to kind of say, well, everyone has different opinions, so who can tell what's right? Right? There is no faith tradition in the world that says when your neighbor gets sick, see how much money you can make off of them, right? There is so much agreement over what our values are, both within Christianity and within and among the world's great faith traditions.
Right.
So there is broad consensus about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Of course, in the 21st century, 2,000 years after Jesus, there are going to be new situations that pop up where we have to ask, what is loving? what does love do in this situation? But part of the genius of the gospel is that Jesus gives us a test to figure out what the right thing to do is in these tough situations. And it's funny, he never says, go find a Bible verse to hurl at your neighbor, right? He says, use your own eyes and ears.
Yeah.
What fruit does that tree bear? Is it good fruit or is it bad fruit? What are the results? He's telling us to use our own experience, which is a remarkable thing to do. And so when I'm looking at, the fruits of the affirming tree and the fruits of the non-affirming tree,
yep,
I see major differences in outcomes.
Yep.
Right? One tree, the affirming tree, leads to flourishing and connection. The other tree, the non-affirming tree, leads to death and despair and disconnection.
Quite literally.
Right.
That's like data points.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, sometimes we overthink some of this stuff.
Yep. Yep.
There will always be progressive Christians and conservative Christians.
Sure.
That's a natural human conversation.
Yep.
Right? Do we keep what we have?
Yeah.
Or do we change into something new? And when you read the Gospels, Jesus is, I can never tell, is he a conservative or a progressive? He's kind of both. Right. So that's a natural conversation, I think, to have. But what I do think we have to speak out against is those who are undermining Christian values.
Yeah.
And I believe that Christian nationalism is a heresy. I believe it is idolatrous. I mean, and Donald Trump Jr. the other day explicitly rejected Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He said, turning the other cheek has, quote, gotten us nothing.
Yep.
So I mean,
turning point
once we get to that point,
that's where he said it.
I think we Christians cannot just stand by and say, well, agree to disagree about turning the other cheek, right?
Right.
Agree to disagree about loving our neighbors.
Yeah.
We do have to stand for our values. We have to stand for Scripture, while still acknowledging that there's always going to be conservatives and progressives, and that's a healthy conversation that we should always celebrate.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably a much deeper conversation for some of the ethics professors here, but I'm with you. And what I struggle with is this, right? Sometimes I hear people say, well, Christian nationalists aren't real Christians. And what I hear them saying is, it's not my responsibility to hold them accountable because they're not really part of us. I'm like, well, here's the thing. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene would probably affirm the same creeds I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know.
She's in the family. She's in the family. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that what she advocates for, while could be Christian in some respect, as far as there's a tradition there that's claimed that, is antichrist in nature. Right? Like if you just read the Sermon on the Mount and then compare it to what she's advocating for, there's a problem. Yeah. But if you look at like the tradition of Christian supremacy in this country, at least, you can see, oh yeah, she's kind of following a path.
Yeah.
I mean, literally last December, I went to America Fest and I'm listening to Charlie Kirk say that we are being replaced, that there's a great replacement happening. And I'm like, I know just enough history to know where that comes from.
Yeah.
And I cannot believe that I'm hearing literal KKK, David Duke Grand Wizard talking points out of the mouth of a man who is also speaking a sermon at the Strong Church Worship Night at that same event about how Christians need to, become more Christian and like take the Bible seriously. I'm just thinking to myself, what are we doing? I mean, I've never said this publicly, but I'll say it now because I don't care anymore. Rob McCoy, Pastor Rob McCoy, this is the guy who really got Charlie Kirk, to go more libertarian, to go more Christian nationalist. I've met him. We've talked multiple times. When I first met him at America Fest, I said, Pastor Rob, I just got to ask you, when I go, I'm really trying to understand because I can't. I'm trying to get the Christian element of this, but literally, you guys want to build crosses for your enemies. I don't know what Bible we're reading, right? So I pulled him aside. I said, I just got to ask you. I said, help me understand what you see, at an event like this that's so dehumanizing, and also what you see in Trump. Like, you're a pastor. What am I missing? Yeah. And he gave me a literal speech that went down the 7 mountain mandate list. Trump's a great businessman, great with family. And I'm like, well, I've heard it now from the horse's mouth. Like I've actually asked the source directly off camera privately, and the answer was so incredibly lackluster. Yeah. And I oscillate between these two like degrees of, is this a political movement that is using Christian language, or is this a theological outworking that has hijacked a political party? Because the last RNC, Bush wasn't there, Romney wasn't there. Like there was no one from like the old RNC or Republican Party at the RNC. It was Charlie Kirk, it was Tucker Carlson. Yeah. So that's had a huge shift too. I'm kind of curious, as one of our last questions, and we'll take a short break. What do you think? Like, do you think Christian nationalism is primarily a political ideology using Christian language, or do you think it's the reverse or a combination of both? How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's important to separate when we're talking about who we can reach and maybe who we can't always reach. Some folks like Charlie Kirk, and Charlie's a very smart,
Yeah.
articulate, and in some ways persuasive. I mean, there's a reason a lot of people listen to him.
Yeah.
He has gifts. I wish he would use those gifts for good.
Same.
But there are things we can learn from some of these folks, and we should always be open to that.
Yeah.
But it's important to separate those who are earning a lot of money pushing this message,
Totally.
manipulating people, versus the folks that they're targeting, right? I think it was Upton Sinclair that said it's hard to change someone's mind when their salary depends on their mind not changing.
Totally.
So, sometimes our energies in a democracy can be better used trying to reach folks whose salary doesn't depend on these lies, and who will be open to a different perspective. But the only way to reach those folks is through relationship.
Yep.
It's through building trust. We have lost the art of persuasion in this democracy. We really have.
Yeah.
These platforms we're on, they are not built for persuasion. They're not built for relationship, right? They are built to get clicks and profit. That's what these platforms are built for. And so I would encourage you as much as you can to get out in the real world, IRL, and build relationships with folks door to door. There's so much research about deep canvassing and the impact of having these authentic conversations with flesh and blood human beings. That's ultimately how we're going to change hearts and minds and build a majority durable enough to protect the democracy we have and then build on it for the future.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say before we take a break, there's a lot of effort spent trying to reach folks who have been the victims, in my opinion, of 50 years of propaganda.
Totally.
And that's a lot of work for us to do in a limited amount of time when we all have limited energy. But I got on TikTok last year in October. My Gen Z staff members told me I should get on. I said, I will, but I'm not dancing. That was my one red line. But I got on there, and it's quickly become our largest platform.
Same.
And I have reached and heard from so many millennials and Gen Zers who are hearing me talk about some of these issues with Christian nationalism and what my faith looks like in the public sphere. And they send me these gut-wrenching messages saying, if I had heard this, I would probably still be in the church.
Totally.
They say, the church, I didn't leave the church left me.
Yep.
There are all these evangelicals who are wondering why young people aren't coming to church. And they say, well, I guess they just have given up on Jesus. And my experience has been they haven't given up on Jesus. They just don't see Jesus in the church.
Yep.
And that group that's on the rise, they are there hungry for this message, hungry for a faith community that doesn't force them to pick between their religion and their neighbor.
Yes.
Or their religion and science.
Yep.
They're hungry for that. That's a whole generation that we could reach. Our energy, which is finite, is probably better spent reaching and organizing those folks than it is trying to convince Charlie Kirk to adopt an opinion that's contrary to his profit incentives.
No, 100%. I mean, there are so many people who did not have a crisis of faith. They had a crisis of theology.
Yeah.
Massive difference.
That's right.
It wasn't, do I believe in God or Jesus? It was, what God or Jesus do I believe in?
Yeah.
And what do I do with this?
Yeah.
And I don't want to trigger anyone here, but to use an evangelical phrase, the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. There are a lot of people, and you talk to them, I do, I know folks here do as well, that are just, they're thirsty for I don't get what happened. I don't know how the church left me, what was going on, but also I can't shake this Jesus thing, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
And it compels me to take this stuff more seriously. One of my critiques of evangelical fundamentalism is that they don't take the Bible seriously enough.
Yeah.
Right? They map on these modern notions and they try and make it compete with science when the biblical authors have no such, that's not their agenda at all.
Right.
I mean, they're entire institutions to maintaining Ken Ham, a biblical worldview on Genesis 1 and 2. It's you're actually desecrating the text. You're just bastardizing it.
Yeah.
And I wish I knew this way earlier.
Well, and I'll
But
say,
it
I
now.
know we've got to go, but
you're
I
good.
will say, I don't think religion's not going away,
Definitely not.
right?
Definitely not.
Old religion, bad theology is dying,
Yeah,
but something new is being born.
totally.
And there's an old Jewish saying that when there are two people in a room, there's politics, which is so accurate, right?
Yeah.
But my pastor growing up also said, when there's one person in the room, there's religion.
Mm.
Because these questions that we kind of late at night think about, what is life? What is the meaning of all of this? Why am I here? What does it mean to be a human being?
Yeah.
Those questions aren't going away. And young people in particular are asking these deep questions. And they're hungry for communities where they can ask those questions with other people
Yep.
and explore answers through scripture, through song, through prayer. That's not going away anytime soon. We've just got to create the spaces for them to do that because they are hungry for it.
Yeah, Jim Wallace says the answer to bad religion is not no religion, it's better religion.
That's right.
And so, I have plenty of friends Andrew Seidel of Americans United, who's sponsoring this event, atheists, we get along great, and he knows like religion, it's a thing. You're not going to get rid of it. Maybe we shouldn't anyway. There's a lot of positive associations with it, with healthy religiosity. Yeah. So I think that it's definitely a both and approach.
And people at this seminary are doing that work. Like some of my classmates are here, brilliant young theologians and pastors and chaplains. Like they are trying to figure out how we rebuild in the wake of this theological devastation.
Yeah.
And it's exciting.
Yeah.
And this moment with Trump in particular, there are groups organizing nationally, groups of pastors who, and I've even seen some statements that they've all signed on to, thousands, kind of reclaiming the faith.
Yep.
And now, I do think we are on the precipice of a new reformation. And I think we could take some of these statements and nail them to the door of a megachurch. So we'll see.
I'm in. I love that. It's great. 100%. If that's you out there, if you're someone who's here as a student and there's a fire under your ass like there is like mine, you're not alone. I promise. There's work to do. All right, listen, this is great. Let's take about a 10-minute break. We can use the bathroom, get more coffee. I'm gonna freeze the QR code for Q&A. You guys can scan it and submit some questions, which I would love questions, please. That'd be great. So that way we don't have to keep talking back and forth. And you're here, so now's the time. And then we'll come back.
Wonderful.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yay.
Friends, I hope you're enjoying this video. The New Evangelicals is a nonprofit organization. If you want to support the work that we do, donating is the most direct way to make an impact as we hold space for folks marginalized by the evangelical church, advocate for accountability in the church, and help people like you find a better path in your faith. You can make a donation at the link in the description. All donations made in the U.S. are tax deductible. We cannot thank you enough for your generosity. It is the reason we're able to make all of this content. All right, we all ready? You can go ahead and find your seats. We'll go for a few minutes here, and then, like I said, we're going to, what's it called? Lazarus, right? Is that the brewing company? We're going there. Is that how you say it? I don't know. But we're going there. It's the one on Airport Boulevard, so you can join.
Look at you. You sound like an Austinite.
Oh, thank God. I've been practicing that all day. So.
One on Airport.
All right. Yeah. So a lot of questions here. This is actually a great one. We can start with you, James. I am a youth director teaching young people 6th to 12th grade. I'm at a more conservative church, but they are also pretty open to new ideas. Yeah. It's unique. How can I be teaching young people better about the radical love of Jesus without causing parents to be mad at me for the woke agenda while still holding true to what Jesus teaches?
I think the teachings and the stories about Jesus are your best friend. I don't think there's any reason to bring an agenda to those conversations with kids. That's the difference between education and indoctrination. As you all know, I used to be a teacher. I was a public school teacher in San Antonio ISD, taught middle school. I often say teaching middle school is the best preparation for serving in the Texas legislature. But kids have the best BS detectors, right? Kids can tell very quickly if you're not shooting straight with them, especially middle and high school kids. So a relationship between a teacher and a student always has to be built on trust, that you're telling them the truth, that you're shooting straight. And that if you are bringing your own political views, just disclosing that and saying, this is how I read this story. This is what I think the implications are for our modern world. But you may have a different opinion. Maybe the next great conservative theologian is in your Sunday school class, and that would be a beautiful thing, right? So I think having those honest conversations, grounding it in truth and grounding it in Scripture, is a great way to avoid bringing in any kind of indoctrinating agenda.
Yeah, that's good. Let's see. This is a good one. I get this one a lot. You talked about our energy spent in talking to people on the ground, those whose minds would be more open. What advice would you give for those of us with families so deep in MAGA, QAnon, etc.? What are the skills that you employ in talking to those folks in your own life?
Yeah, and I have a lot of
mic a little bit closer.
Yeah, and I have a lot of family members who have voted for Donald Trump, who are conservative evangelical Christians, and so I know what this is like. I know it can be difficult. I said earlier, the only way, in my experience, that hearts and minds change is through relationship. I don't see any way around that, and that starts with listening. I took my pastoral care class here at the seminary, and we spent so much time at the beginning of that class talking about the art of listening, and how so many of us, including me, have just forgotten how to do it. Actually listen. It's such a difficult thing to do because you just want to, I say this as I'm speaking into a microphone, but like you always just want to jump in with your thoughts or your perspective. To actually listen, it's kind of painful to stop yourself from talking. The only times that I've seen hearts and minds change in politics is when listening is at the front, is at the center. So when you're talking about how do I persuade my family members, maybe not start with persuasion, but start with listening, because I bet you're going to find what values y'all can start to build something off of. And this is the last thing I'll say about this.
Sure.
The political science, the sociological science shows the best way to persuade people is to use their values, not your values. And I know this is true because when my Republican colleagues persuade me of stuff, which happens, it does happen. There have been issues where I've changed my mind because a Republican colleague has convinced me. And it's because they show me how their bill on whatever topic is actually truer to my progressive values. That is the best way to change someone's heart, change someone's mind. It's not to just browbeat them with your values. It's to find what do they value and then build off of that. That's been what's worked for me. So listening, relationship, finding out what their values are, and then aligning your perspective or your policy or your candidate to those values. It's not always going to work, but I think over time, with enough trust, enough of a relationship, it can work.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people often that I didn't change my mind on a lot of issues because I was called a homophobic bigot on Facebook. I was like, oh, you're right. It was stories. It was people who held space for me who didn't need to, but they chose to. And they asked me questions. I mean, one of the ones I always cite is I grew up on a steady diet of talk radio, which is how I grew up. And my friend, my first ever gay friend, and he knows this, I tell this story all the time, so I had permission to use it. But I met him at Starbucks, and he was my first coworker. He was gay, and I'm like, oh my gosh, my parents have warned me about these people, right? And of course, it was nothing like what I was told. And that's just the truth, though. I was 18. I just didn't know. And we became quite friendly. We kept in touch after we stopped working there, and we'd talk over Facebook, as we all did back then, I guess. And he would say, like, I don't get it, Tim. Like, you listen to these people who talk about freedom. How about my freedom to marry who I want? I'm like, well, you got a point. You have a point. That's what eventually persuaded me over time. But back to the family dynamic, and I get this question so often. I want to hold space for the wide variety of family situations and dynamics, right? Like maybe you're someone who is realizing that you're LGBTQ plus, and your parents, if you told them, it would just sever that relationship. So I can't speak to every possible situation that someone could be wrestling through with that. I'll just speak from personal experience, but my parents, who truly are great human beings, and it's weird because my parents are very conservative, and they would probably vote how you would think. And yet I've just watched them do things in their private life that doesn't match some of their own policies. I've watched them pay people's mortgages for months without telling anyone because they just wanted to help out their neighbor. Like just things where I'm like, how does this work? But they kind of know what I do to a degree, and we don't really talk about it. And I have found, to your point, that me and my partner, my wife, when we had our two kids, my parents are amazing grandparents. Like they love my kids dearly. They respect our boundaries. They're really great with them. And it gives us a night off too sometimes, which is always nice, But we decided that we were going to focus on the relationship over the politics, because I don't think going in and, to your point, browbeating them and telling them how terrible Trump is or their politics are, I don't think it would have done anything besides alienated us further from them, which would definitely close the door to any kind of change. But our hope is that by us modeling, like, listen, we can make room for you. Can you make room for us? Which, for someone who gets saved at age 18, like my parents did, and become a fundamentalist, it's really hard to do that. It's just it's so hard to explain the world unless you're in it that deeply. But it's hard for people in that space to just accept others for thinking differently. It's complicated. But our thought is that, hey, if we can show them that we can make room for them, I'm not going to try and change your mind. We love you guys. We love that you're great with the grandkids. That's our focus. Can you make room for us? That kind of puts it on them, right? To say, it's not on us, guys, to cut this off. It's on you if you want to, but we don't want to. And that has been, I think, the path for us going forward. But again, every situation is different, and some parents don't respect those boundaries. And I think as adults, you're allowed to make those decisions when it gets difficult. So I don't want to pretend that my situation is yours. It's not. But I think that's the question I get asked most, is I have these family members who, whatever it is, or Thanksgiving is really hard. So what do I do with that? And it's tricky. Yeah.
And I think you got to figure out, are you trying to make, and this is something I tell young organizers a lot, less about interpersonal family dynamics, but out in the community, are you trying to make a point or are you trying to make change? Making a point can feel real good, and sometimes you just need to do that. But that is different than making change. One is about your own needs and gratification, and the other is about something bigger than yourself. And it's always just good to check yourself and figure, which one am I trying to do right here? Because the strategy will be different.
This is a good question. I like this one. What advice would you give to a Republican Christian who disagrees with the views of radical evangelicals, but still upholds Republican values like being pro-life and supporting common sense border control? I don't necessarily want to vote Democrat, but I also don't want to endorse extreme views of the current Republican Party. If that is from first-hand experience and you're here, thank you, by the way, for being here for this conversation. That's a good question. It's a fair question. People live in tension sometimes. What are your thoughts?
Politics is not that different from a middle school cafeteria. Think about back when you were in middle school and you walked in that cafeteria. There wasn't a lot of logic on what table you sat at. You sat at the table where people wanted you. That was it, right? So much of politics is that. I think oftentimes about the Democratic Party is a multiracial coalition, and Black Americans are the core of the Democratic coalition. But there are a lot of conservative Black Americans. There are some progressive ones. The reason that Black folks tend to vote for the Democratic Party in such overwhelming numbers is that, at least in recent American history, our party has said that you can sit with us. And so I think it's, at least for my party, and now I'm putting on my politician hat, it's important for some of these Republicans who feel that their party has left them to say, you can sit with us. We're not going to agree on everything. A lot of members of the Democratic coalition don't agree on lots of different things. But we have some core values that it sounds like you may agree with us on. Democracy, public education. These things that's enough common ground to build a coalition off of. So again, I said earlier, politics is about addition, not subtraction. That's the way our system is designed to work. There's no runner-up on election night. You win if you get the most votes, if you get a majority. And that should be our goal when we're working in a political space in a democracy, is winning a majority. If you look back at the Great Society or the New Deal, my side, when we made the biggest changes in this country, it's when we had durable majorities that could deliver change for people. And so that's what I'm always chasing. Are big majorities that can get something done in this country.
Honestly, what I would say to this person, and I mean this, just go to both candidates' websites and read their full agendas. Like, they're right there. Like, Agenda 47 is on Trump's website. The Harris-Walz ticket, they are very clear. It's very detailed. And just see which one you think might overall better align with your values. To be clear, we are structured as a nonprofit. We do not endorse candidates. We actually respect the Johnson Amendment, unlike some other people that I know who have nonprofits. Charlie Kirk. But and it's up to you. But I recommend like just looking. Their platforms are there. I went to the DNC. I heard a lot of things to your point where I was like, this is great, and also some points where I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this. So just do the work. They're very blatant. You can read about Project 2025. The whole 900-page playbook, if you want, is available. And so it's all there. And I would just go from there.
And this is something I tell people, young people in our coalition, is a vote is not a marriage proposal, right? A vote is a chess move for a better world.
Yeah.
It's strategic. You're not getting someone who's going to fulfill every need that you have.
Yeah.
That's not how this works.
Yeah.
It's important. And you and I talk, the decline of organized religion means that a lot of people make politics their religion.
Yep.
And that's really dangerous. That's when you start seeing kind of these messianic movements around politicians.
Yeah.
On both sides of the aisle. The idea that a politician can save us, that leads to some pretty dangerous territory, has throughout history.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's so important that we rebuild faith communities so that people can kind of learn the difference between religion and politics. You need both in a healthy democracy. But right now we really only have one, and people are in unhealthy ways treating their politics like their religion.
Yeah.
And you're bound to get disappointed because politicians are imperfect people. They're doing a job that you hired us to do, trying to pass public policy. We're just like a mechanic that you hire to fix your car. You hire us to pass public policy, and that's what we do. It's a job. We are not your Messiah.
Right.
We're not here to save the world. We're here to do a particular job in this democratic system of ours. And your vote is just picking between mechanics. And that's all it is. And we shouldn't put more into it than that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I this is kind of a side note to that question, but I just really recommend like looking at the people that tend to be attracted and the people underneath the leaders that would be assigned to positions. That's really important. Like I just really recommend you look into names like, I don't know, Doug Wilson. Just see what he's advocating for, and how he's speaking at Turning Point USA Faith events. Like just see what kind of people and what policies and what they're advocating for and what party they're finding themselves in, and how that party might not be talking about those people at all and just kind of silently welcoming them in. That's important to keep an eye out, because I tell people often, I don't want to sound like talk radio. I grew up on, Glenn Beck crying when Obama got elected. Oh, it's the end of America. And so I don't want to sound like that draconian. But at the same time, there's also a lot of receipts of why we should be really concerned about some of the things that are bubbling beneath the surface of particular potential administrations and who's behind them. And the more you educate yourself on those things, I just believe that it becomes clearer for this particular moment. To your point, it's not a blood oath to any political party. It's not a marriage proposal, but we have to read the moment we're in, read the context we're in, read the historical, stream that we're participating in, and then decide accordingly what we do for this election. And then we do the same thing for the next one. We do the same digging. That's important. This is a good question. I'm going to just make it a little more concise, but essentially the question is, how do we help Christians understand that they can both advocate for reproductive rights and work to reduce abortion rates? And I gotta be honest, this one gets me the most fired up, because if you look at the graphs, abortion rates plummeted the most under Democratic presidents. Texas, which I'm now in the state of Texas, usually I use it as an example, but unfortunately, because of what has happened with these abortion bans, infant and maternal mortality rates have gone up, not down. We all know the story of Kate Cox. Like these have real world effects that they don't lead to the outcomes that people say they're going to lead to. And I think it's a really good question, because I often ask myself, I don't hear a lot of Democratic politicians saying that. I don't know why. I just kind of hear like we're pro-choice, and I believe everyone should have access to those rights, and I agree, but also like the data is there. These access to these things actually do reduce abortion rates as a natural byproduct. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we talked earlier about 50 years of propaganda since the moral majority.
Yeah.
That has convinced Christians, and I'm talking mostly about white Protestant Christians in this country, that the two most important issues are abortion and homosexuality.
Yeah.
Two issues that Jesus never talked about,
Yeah.
even though they both existed in the ancient world. When I open my Bible, I don't see any verses about abortion. I see more than 2,000 verses about economic justice.
Right.
I don't see any verses about gay marriage, consensual, loving relationships between two members of the same sex, but I see hundreds of verses about welcoming the stranger and feeding the hungry and healing the sick and freeing the oppressed and loving the outcast. So one, I think it's important to root ourselves in Scripture and push back against this propaganda and ask people to dig into why they believe that abortion should be the number one voting issue for Christians in this country. And we should feel comfortable pushing back against that. And then I think we should go one level deeper and talk about, let's take abortion because that's what the question is asking. I don't think there are many people in this country or around the world who actually believe in embryonic personhood. Maybe Pope Francis is the only person who believes in it. Because the reason I know that is because I've seen the polling on IVF.
Yep.
I've seen the polling on exceptions for rape and incest and threats to the mother's health. If you believe in embryonic personhood, you can't support any of that.
Yep.
Right? And Pope Francis doesn't. So most Americans, and I'm talking 90, 95%, do not believe that an embryo is a legal person. Now, the embryo is biologically alive. That is certainly true. But being alive and being a person are two different things. And that's an important distinction to make in these conversations. So the reason I think you have a lot of pro-choice people who push back against the idea that abortion is immoral is because they believe that it is not. That in these situations, when there is an unwanted pregnancy, it is moral for a woman to be able to control her own body, or any one of our neighbors with the uterus to be able to control their own body. That said, I think we should all feel comfortable saying that we should reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. You know, it's kind of a tautology, right? Like we should not want unwanted pregnancies. And we know how to do that.
We do.
We know the way to do that is scientifically valid sex education for every kid.
Yeah.
By the way, that's also how you help kids escape abuse.
Yep.
Getting rid of sex ed is a gift to abusers.
100%.
And to pedophiles.
So are unaccountable churches another gift for those?
Available contraception. All kinds of public health initiatives, tackling the maternal health crisis. All of these things can help reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. And that should be even if you are Pope Francis and you believe in embryonic personhood. Again, I would really ask most people in your life if they actually subscribe to that. Yeah. And if they do, I'm not judging that opinion. I admire Pope Francis, and he is consistent in his pro-life positions. He's against poverty. He's against war. Yep. But I would posit that most Americans do not believe in embryonic personhood. And so, but even if you do, we should be able to find common ground on reducing the number of unwanted pregnancies in this state and in this country. Yeah. And we know the policy levers to pull to make that happen.
100%. To give people an idea of how unpopular this new war on IVF actually is, because that's the thing that's happening in some of these more right-wing spaces. Ali Beth Stuckey, who's a right-wing pundit, whenever she talks about how IVF should be banned, her own audience ratios her in the comments. And they're like, actually, no, Ali, like my children are because of IVF, you know? And I do think that what concerns me is the direction I've seen the pro-life movement start to turn in. They call themselves the abolitionist movement now, and it's intentional. They use that language intentionally. People like Jeff Durbin and others who are very extreme in their religious evangelical American Calvinist beliefs, who believe in legislation that if a woman gets an abortion, she should be put to death. I mean, this is not exaggeration. You can just Google Jeff Durbin, abortion, and the clip comes right up where he says that. To him, it's like a mother murdering her 7-year-old. I mean, that's how they equate it. And those people have tried to pass legislation in certain states to try and make that a thing. And now we're seeing people like Al Mohler and others start to say, well, how about IVF? And then we saw the Alabama justices, et cetera. So I agree completely with what you said. What concerns me is how a very small group of people who are very unpopular are getting a hold of levers of power that could potentially, really do a lot of damage to things that are actually life-giving, ultimately, instead of what they claim is murdering children.
And the beauty of a democracy is we're going to see if those ideas are popular.
Yeah.
And we've seen since Dobbs that the vast majority of Americans are pro-choice.
Yep.
And I think we're going to see here in Texas in a few weeks backlash at the ballot box for this extreme abortion ban. And I'll also, I said that there's no verses in our Bible about abortion, and that is technically true. But there are verses that that reject embryonic personhood and affirm female personhood. I'm thinking of the passage in Exodus that if a woman dies as the result of a miscarriage, or if a miscarriage occurs as a result of a fight, it's a fine. But if the woman dies, it's the punishment is death. Not that we should be basing our laws off of ancient texts, but I do think they provide us some clues to the morality of some of these positions, especially for folks who want to use Scripture to find out what the right thing to do is. And the one thing you have to say about the New Testament is that Jesus repeatedly affirms the full personhood of women. The longest conversation that Jesus has in the Bible with anybody is with the Samaritan woman at the well. The only person to teach Jesus something new is the Syrophoenician woman. The only person to beat Jesus in a debate is the Syrophoenician woman. He violated first century norms by talking with women, trusting women, learning from women. This is someone who is ahead of their time in terms of gender equality. And Paul tells us that in Christ there is neither male nor female. Sounds pretty woke to me.
Paul, the Marxist.
The woke agenda. You got to do something about that, St. Paul.
Real troublemaker. That
so
guy.
My point. So although I said there's no verses explicitly about abortion, I do believe there's a lot of scriptural precedent for believing in the full personhood of women and the ability for them to control their own bodies in this country.
Cool. All right, last question. And we'll do, this is like a both and. So it's November 6th. Trump is elected president. How do we respond? How do we live?
We get back to work. People throughout history have faced worse crises, and they persevered. And I think our faith tradition has a lot to teach us. It was built for times like this. Built for worse times. It was built to endure some pretty difficult and traumatic times. And so, our confession as Christians is that love is more powerful than violence. It's more powerful than hate. It's more powerful than domination. And in the end, it will win. Violence may win in the short run, but in the end, love always wins. That is our confession. I don't know if I have any, I do believe there's scientific evidence for that, but it's not something I can necessarily prove objectively. And that's why it's called faith. I put my trust in the power of love. That's Christianity at its core. And everyone has a faith. Everyone puts their trust in something. A lot of people put their trust in money, in power, in status, in science. I put my trust in love. And that's what helps me through the tough times. It's what helped people through much tougher times than this.
Okay, it's November 6th. Harris is elected president. What do we do? How do we live?
Well, I think we won we celebrate that historic moment. I became an uncle last year for the first time.
Congrats.
My little baby niece was born in March of last year. And it's mind-blowing to me that if Vice President Harris is elected, Jane will only know a female president. And there are a lot of much better reasons to vote for Vice President Harris, particularly her policies, her experience, her knowledge, her talents as a leader. But I do think the day after the election, if that happens, it is a time to kind of bask in the glow of history. We'll have time to get to work once she's inaugurated, and we will pressure her to do the right thing on all kinds of issues. We will organize to make sure that she follows through on her campaign promises. But the day after the election is a moment just to step back and reflect on how much progress we've made as a country if we elect someone like Kamala Harris, President of the United States.
I love that. James, I can't thank you for your time. It's been so much fun. I love having everyone here. I just wanted to say really quick, and then we're going to end. It is truly an honor to be able to come out to Austin to do this. It is very difficult being in this position because I talk to a camera most of my day in my guest bedroom. And I always
do it very well.
Yeah,
you do it very well.
But I'm in my guest bedroom, like, hope someone's seeing this. But the reality is, selfishly, I love doing in-person events because, like many of you, I also feel alone at times. I also feel like, man, am I the only one seeing this stuff? Am I the only one like pushing for the change and just yelling? Am I yelling into a void, of just like the internet, hoping someone picks this up? And I want you to know, in case it's not clear, that you are certainly not alone. And one of the reasons why we love doing in-person events, and I'm hoping to do more over time, is so not just so we can travel and make fun content and do things for YouTube and talk to amazing people, but so you realize that there are people in your community who might be closer than you think, who are aligned. And so you don't feel as alone as when you did when you first lost your church community. Many of you who follow our work know my story, that when I started TNE, within a few months, my church that I was at for 6 years as a volunteer drummer gave me the option to either stop serving with them as a drummer or to stop doing the work I was starting to do. I mean, we weren't a nonprofit. I wasn't doing this full time. And I resigned my position as a volunteer drummer. Because that was the line, and I lost that community, almost overnight. And I get those DMs often, and I know how painful that is. Like I know the rage, I know the anger, I know the bewilderment, right? Of just going, I don't get it. Like I gave everything. I thought we were all in. I thought we were doing life together. I thought we were family, and because I am just questioning some things about like how we love our neighbors, that line is too far. I totally get that pain 100%. And to your point, James, and I was talking to Zach Lambert, who's here too, who's part of the Post-Evangelical Collective. We were talking about how even when things, fall apart and they disintegrate and you lose so much, I do feel like, and I'm biased, obviously. I do this work, so this is all I see. But I do feel like there have been some new seeds planted, and there are some sprouts starting to kind of pop up. And I do believe, along with you, that we are, but they say every 500 years, there's a new kind of Reformation kind of vibe that happens, and we're due. And it might be a smaller group. Maybe we don't have all the money or all the billionaires funding us, or we don't have the big organizations, but there is something happening, not just with TNE, but with many other groups. And I talk to all of them. Behind the scenes. We're all connected. There is something happening that feels really good. And I'm hopeful that no matter what happens this election, that we understand that the work is just beginning. The moral majority was in the 80s, and they have built strong organizations with a lot of money and a lot of networking over decades. This is not just you save democracy because of one election, then you're done. The work really starts after the election, no matter who is in power. So to your point, being a Christ follower is radical. It is a life calling. It is a narrow road, not in the same sense I used to believe, like I'm going to burn in hell forever, but the calling of the Christian is very specific. And we certainly, I'm sure you feel the same way, we need all of us in this room and those watching, on YouTube and wherever else you see this, to be in the fight with us, not to conquer our enemies. I love what Dr. Espinosa says. They say, we don't want to destroy supremacy. We want to compost supremacy. I love that language. It's so much better than like, I don't want to destroy my neighbor. I want to invite my enemies into a better way of living. Right now, to your point, I don't know if Charlie Kirk will ever do that, but my neighbor down the street might. If I can say, can you think about maybe a better way forward where we can all flourish? There's plenty of room. So I hope that tonight was encouraging for all of you. I appreciate all of you listening to our podcast and who came out because you heard about this through our channels. And James, I thank you for coming out. Make sure you hang out for a few minutes, friends. We're happy to hang out for a little bit, and we'll see you all at the brewery after. So thank you.
Okay, I can explain. This guy was on Turo, and it was so affordable. It was so cheap. I couldn't believe how cheap it was. So I had to spring for the rental. And I think this is my way of getting around the whole rich man can't enter the kingdom mantra, because technically we're renting it, so I'm not really rich. We're just pretending that we're wealthy for like a day and a half. I swear we got it for a steal. It was just as cheap as a normal rental that's an SUV. So I had to do it.
This video is sponsored by Turo.
Almost 90 there.
Hey, Ford Ranger.
Oh, is it gonna go? It's going! Oh my god! Wow. Oh, no, you didn't do that. You didn't do that. I didn't do that. That was Extremism. Different lane. Different lane. There's a car. Oh my god, dude. Okay, I'm taking over. I'm all good. No more. I'm all done with you.
Tim does not know how to turn off the car.
How do you turn off a Tesla? Computer off. Dude, really, for real, how would you turn it off? No way! Chick-fil-A! You gotta be kidding me! That's